It was the camp that said, hey, we can pull DNA out of mummies, and the other camp that said, no, you can't. They said, DNA can't possibly last for more than 6.
For thousands of years, Egypt controlled its own story. Pharaohs carved their version of history into stone, and stone doesn't lie. But then, scientists discovered something stone can't hide. When they tested the DNA of mummies of Egypt's most famous rulers, the results didn't match the official story. The royal bloodline wasn't as pure as Egypt claimed. Foreign ancestry showed up in places it wasn't supposed to, and suddenly, Egypt stopped allowing independent testing. What did the DNA reveal? Why is Egypt blocking scientists from looking again? Join us as we expose the genetic truth Egypt refuses to admit. The DNA test Egypt controls. In February 2010, the Journal of the American Medical Association published one of the most anticipated scientific papers in Egyptology history. DNA results from 11 royal mummies, including Tutankhamun, finally revealed the genetic secrets of Egypt's most famous dynasty. Or at least that's what the headline said. The study was led by Zahi Hawass, Egypt's most powerful archaeological official at the time, and it involved a team of Egyptian and international researchers working under strict government oversight. The findings made global news. Tutan's parents were identified. Genetic diseases were confirmed. Family relationships that historians had debated for decades were suddenly proven through molecular evidence. But what the media didn't emphasize was how tightly Egypt controlled every aspect of the research. The mummies were tested in Egyptian labs using Egyptian equipment under Egyptian supervision. The foreign scientists on the team had limited access to the remains and no independent authority over how samples were collected or processed. More importantly, the raw genetic data was never released to the public or made available to outside researchers for verification. In legitimate scientific studies, especially ones making extraordinary claims, raw data gets published alongside the conclusions. Other labs can review it, test it, and attempt to replicate the findings. That's how science builds credibility. Egypt never did that. The study included summaries of genetic relationships and disease markers, but not the complete sequencing data that would allow independent analysis. When researchers asked why, the explanation was always the same. The data belonged to Egypt, and sharing it widely would violate the cultural sanctity of the royal remains. That reasoning might sound respectful on the surface, but it creates a serious problem. Without access to raw data, no one outside Egypt's approved circle can verify whether the conclusions are accurate or complete. It also means Egypt retains total control over what gets studied and what gets ignored. The 2010 study focused heavily on disease and immediate family relationships. It confirmed Tutankhamun men had malaria and a bone disorder. It showed his parents were siblings. It traced a genetic line back 3 generations. All useful information, but also safe information. Nothing controversial, nothing that challenged Egypt's preferred narrative about royal ancestry. What the study didn't do was compare the royal DNA to broader population groups across Africa, the Mediterranean, or the Near East. That kind of analysis would reveal deeper ancestral origins and show genetic connections to populations outside Egypt's borders. Egypt has consistently refused to conduct or authorize that broader comparison, and it won't let anyone else do it either. The justification is always vague. Officials say it's unnecessary or politically sensitive or disrespectful to the dead. But those explanations don't hold up under scrutiny because the testing itself already happened. The samples exist. The technology exists. What doesn't exist is permission. Egypt designed the study to answer specific questions while carefully avoiding others. It published enough to satisfy public curiosity, but not enough to allow independent verification or deeper analysis. That's not transparency. That's control. And when a government controls the testing, the samples, the labs, the publication process, and the raw data, it also controls the story those mummies tell. The DNA results Egypt released in 2010 weren't wrong. They just weren't complete. And the parts left out might be the most important parts of all. Yuya, the man who didn't fit. Yuya wasn't supposed to matter this much. He wasn't a pharaoh, never commanded armies, never built temples with his name carved in stone, but his DNA sits at the genetic center of Egypt's most powerful royal dynasty, and that makes him impossible to ignore. He was buried in the Valley of the Kings in 1905 in Tomb K 546 with a level of wealth and honor that shocked the archaeologists who found him. His mummy was remarkably well preserved, his face still recognizable, his features distinct, and those features didn't look like the other royal mummies. Early researchers noted it immediately. Yuya's skull shape was different. His facial structure was different. His hair, still attached to his mummy, had a texture that didn't match the typical appearance of native Egyptians from the 18th dynasty. Some described him as having foreign characteristics. Though modern Egyptologists avoid that phrasing now because it opens uncomfortable questions about where he actually came from. What's not in dispute is his family connection. Yuya's daughter, Tyr, became the great royal wife of Amenhotep III, one of Egypt's most powerful pharaohs. That made Yuya the grandfather of Akhenaten and the great-grandfather of Tutankhamun. His blood didn't just touch royalty, it became royalty. When the 2010 DNA study included Yuya in the tested mummies, researchers expected his genetic profile to help explain the royal family's ancestry. If anyone's DNA could reveal outside influences in the bloodline, it would be his because he came from outside the royal family entirely. But the published results barely mentioned him. The study confirmed his relationship to Tia and traced his genetic connection to Tutankhamun through the maternal line, but it didn't analyze what his DNA said about his own ancestry or where his people originated. That omission wasn't accidental. Yuya's genetic markers didn't fit the narrow Egyptian profile the study was designed to emphasize, and expanding the analysis to explain his background would have required exactly the kind of broader population comparison Egypt refuses to conduct. Some researchers who reviewed the study's data noticed something else. Yuya's genetic profile showed markers that appeared more frequently in populations from the Levant and Mesopotamia than in native Nile Valley groups. Those observations were never officially confirmed because Egypt controls access to the raw data. But they align with what physical anthropologists had suspected for decades based on his mummy's appearance. If Yuya carried significant foreign ancestry, then so did his descendants. Ta passed his genes to Akhenaten passed them to Tutankhamun. The foreign blood Yuya introduced didn't disappear. It became part of the royal line for generations. Egypt has never addressed this directly. When Yuya comes up in discussions about royal ancestry, the response is either silence or vague statements about Egyptian diversity that don't actually answer the question. But the question remains, who was Yuya before he married into royalty? Where did his family come from? And why does Egypt avoid examining the one mummy whose DNA could prove the royal bloodline wasn't as purely Egyptian as the official narrative claims? Yuya's tomb was one of the richest ever found. His mummy was preserved with extraordinary care. His descendants ruled Egypt at the height of its power, but his origins remain a mystery Egypt refuses to solve. Akhenaten, a pharaoh with no clean origin. Akhenaten is one of the most studied pharaohs in Egyptian history and also one of the least understood. His reign was short, radical, and deliberately erased by his successors. His body, if it's ever been found, keeps changing identity depending on who's interpreting the evidence. The mummy known as KV55 is officially recognized by Egypt as Akhenaten, but that identification has been disputed, revised, and questioned for over a century. When the tomb was discovered in 1907, the remains inside were damaged and poorly preserved. Early examinations estimated the body belonged to someone in their early 20s, far too young to be Akhenaten, who ruled for at least 17 years and fathered multiple children. For decades, Egyptologists debated whether KV55 was Akhenaten, his possible co-regent Smenkhare, or someone else entirely. The age didn't match. The physical evidence was ambiguous, and the burial context was confusing. Then the 2010 DNA study declared the debate over. According to genetic testing, KV55 was Tutankhamun's father, which meant it had to be Akhenaten. Egypt presented this as definitive proof and closed the case. But the age problem never went away. New examinations using updated methods have produced wildly different estimates, some now suggesting the remains could belong to someone in their 40s, others still insisting the body is too young. Egypt's response to these contradictions has been to quietly adjust the narrative each time without admitting the previous conclusion was uncertain. When the age doesn't fit, the explanation becomes that disease or stress aged the body differently, or that ancient Egyptians matured at different rates. What makes Akhenaten especially problematic for Egypt is that his entire reign was an anomaly. He abandoned the traditional gods, moved the capital to a new city built from nothing, and imposed a monotheistic religion that Egypt violently rejected after his death. His art shows him with an elongated skull, feminine hips, and a distended belly. Some scholars argue this was symbolic or stylistic, but others believe it reflected real physical abnormalities caused by genetic disorders. The DNA study found evidence of inherited conditions in the royal family, but it didn't explain why Akhenaten looks so different from his father, Amenhotep III, or why his religious revolution was so alien to Egyptian tradition. Some researchers have quietly suggested Akhenaten's sudden rise and radical changes hint at a bloodline that wasn't entirely Egyptian, possibly connected through his grandmother Mutamuya or great-grandfather Yuya, both of whom show signs of foreign origin. Egypt rejects this interpretation completely and insists Akhenaten was fully Egyptian, just unusual in his religious vision and artistic choices. But unusual doesn't explain why his successors tried to erase him from history. Unusual doesn't explain why his name was chiseled off monuments and his city abandoned. Unusual doesn't explain why his body, if KB55 really is his, was buried in a hastily reused tomb with damaged inscriptions. Akhenaten wasn't just different. He was wrong somehow in ways that made Egypt want to forget he ever existed. And the DNA that could explain what made him so wrong is locked in samples Egypt won't fully analyze or share. The mummy's identity keeps shifting. The explanations keep changing. And the one constant is Egypt's refusal to let anyone look closely enough to know for sure. Tutankhamun's DNA wasn't the whole story. The 2010 study was marketed to the public as the definitive answer to the mystery of Tutankhamun's death and lineage. Headlines called it groundbreaking. Museums updated their displays. Documentaries presented the findings as settled science. But what the study actually revealed was far narrower than what people were led to believe. The research focused almost exclusively on two things: identifying Tutankhamun's immediate family members and cataloging genetic diseases that might explain his early death and physical disabilities. Both goals were achieved. The study confirmed his father was the mummy in K-Mavi 55. His mother was a sister of that same man, and his grandparents included Amenhotep III and Yuya's daughter, Ta. It also found genetic markers for malaria, a bone disorder called collar disease, and a club foot, all of which likely contributed to his fragile health and early death at around 19 years old. That information answered questions Egyptologists had been debating for decades, and it was genuinely valuable. But it wasn't the whole story, and it was never meant to be. What the study deliberately avoided was the bigger question that geneticists outside Egypt kept asking. Where did this royal family originally come from? That question requires a completely different kind of DNA analysis. Instead of just comparing mummies to each other, you compare them to reference populations from across Africa, the Mediterranean, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and Anatolia. Modern genetic databases contain samples from ancient populations in all those regions. Matching the royal mummies against those databases would reveal ancestral origins, migration patterns, and genetic connections to groups outside Egypt's borders. The technology to do this existed in 2010, and it's only gotten more precise since then. The analysis wouldn't have required additional samples or invasive testing. It could have been done using the DNA that was already extracted. Egypt chose not to do it. The study's methodology section makes this clear. The researchers explicitly limited their analysis to familial relationships and disease markers. Population genetics and ancestry comparison were not part of the approved scope. That limitation wasn't a scientific necessity. It was a deliberate boundary set by Egyptian authorities before the research began. When asked why, Egypt's explanation was that the study's purpose was medical and genealogical, not anthropological. Ancestry questions were considered outside the project's goals. But that framing is misleading because understanding where a royal family came from is directly relevant to understanding who they were. Genetics doesn't separate neatly into medical versus ancestral categories. The same DNA that shows disease also shows origin. Egypt's refusal to include ancestry analysis suggests the government knew what that data might reveal and decided it was safer not to look. The study confirmed Tutankhamun's parents were closely related, which explained his health problems. But it didn't explain where his great-great-grandparents came from, or whether the royal line carried significant genetic input from populations outside Egypt. Those answers exist in the samples Egypt still controls. The DNA is there, preserved and cataloged, us waiting for analysis that Egypt refuses to authorize. The 2010 study wasn't wrong about what it tested. It was incomplete by design. It answered the questions Egypt wanted answered and carefully avoided the ones Egypt didn't want asked. That's not how comprehensive science works. That's how controlled science works. And the difference matters because the story Egypt told the world wasn't false. It just wasn't finished. Foreign blood on the throne. Egypt's official history celebrates its pharaohs as masters of diplomacy, forging alliances with kingdoms across the ancient world. Royal marriages, sealed treaties with Mitanni, Babylon, and the Hittite Empire. Egyptian princesses were sent abroad, and foreign princesses arrived in Egypt to become queens. This isn't speculation or revisionist history. It's documented in diplomatic correspondence carved on temple walls and recorded in ancient letters that survived thousands of years. Amenhotep III married at least 2 princesses from Mitanni. Thutmose IV took a Mitanni wife who became the mother of his heir. Ramesses I married a Hittite princess in a ceremony that was commemorated with monuments and official declarations. These weren't symbolic marriages or minor political gestures. These women held the title of Great Royal Wife, lived in palace quarters, bore children who could inherit the throne, and shaped the succession of Egyptian power for generations. Egypt openly acknowledges all of this in museum exhibitions and historical timelines. The diplomatic marriages are presented as evidence of Egypt's international prestige and sophisticated political strategy. But when the conversation shifts to genetics, Egypt's tone changes completely. Suddenly, those same marriages are described as culturally insignificant, genetically irrelevant, or too isolated to have meaningfully affected the royal bloodline. The logic collapses under basic scrutiny. If a Mitanni princess becomes queen and her son becomes pharaoh, Mitanni DNA enters the royal line. That's not interpretation, that's biology. And it didn't happen once. It happened repeatedly across multiple dynasties spanning hundreds of years. The genetic impact should be obvious and traceable using the same DNA analysis Egypt applied to disease and parentage. Markers from Levantine, Anatolian, and Mesopotamian populations would show up clearly in the royal mummies if Egypt bothered to look for them, but Egypt refuses to conduct that analysis, and it blocks outside researchers who want to do it independently. The explanation is always vague. Officials say ancestry comparison is politically sensitive, or that it risks misinterpretation, or that it disrespects the cultural identity of ancient Egypt. What they don't say is why proving Egyptian pharaohs had some foreign ancestry would be disrespectful, especially when Egypt itself admits the marriages happened. Oh, the contradiction is glaring. Egypt wants credit for being an international power connected to the wider ancient world. But it also wants to preserve the idea that its royal bloodline remained genetically pure and distinctly Egyptian, despite centuries of intermarriage with foreign nobility. Both things can't be true at the same time. Either the royal family stayed isolated and avoided meaningful genetic mixing, which would contradict the historical record of diplomatic marriages, or they married foreigners whose DNA became part of the royal line, which would show up in genetic testing. Egypt has chosen to celebrate the marriages while denying their biological consequences. And that position only makes sense if the government is afraid of what the DNA might actually prove. The foreign queens existed. Their children ruled. Their blood flowed through the veins of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. Egypt doesn't deny the history. Well, it just refuses to confirm what that history means genetically. And that refusal says more than any DNA test ever could. The evidence is there, documented in stone and preserved in royal tombs. Egypt simply won't let science verify what the historical record already proves. Why independent testing is still blocked. Since the 2010 study was published, dozens of independent researchers from universities and genetic institutes around the world have submitted formal requests to retest the royal mummies using updated DNA technology. Every single request has been denied. The reasons Egypt gives vary depending on who's asking and what political climate exists at the time, but the answer is always the same. No access, no samples, no independent verification. Sometimes the explanation is technical. Egypt says the mummies are too fragile for additional testing. And even though modern DNA extraction requires samples so small they're barely visible and cause no structural damage to remains, other times the justification is cultural. Officials claim that further testing would disrespect the dead and violate the sanctity of royal burials, even though those same mummies are displayed in glass cases for millions of tourists to photograph every year. When researchers offer to use non-invasive methods or work exclusively with samples already extracted during the 2010 study, Egypt shifts to a different argument. The samples belong to Egypt, and sharing them with foreign labs would undermine national sovereignty over cultural heritage. That framing turns a scientific question into a political one, which is exactly what Egypt wants, because political disputes don't require evidence or transparency. They just require power. Egypt has all the power here. It controls the mummies, the samples, the permits, and the legal framework that governs who gets access and under what conditions. Independent verification, the most basic requirement of legitimate science, becomes impossible when one government controls every step of the process and refuses outside participation. Some researchers have tried compromise. They've offered to collaborate with Egyptian scientists to conduct all testing in Egyptian facilities, to share findings before publication, and to acknowledge Egyptian oversight at every stage. Egypt still says no. Others have requested access only to the raw genetic data from the 2010 study, arguing that reanalysis using newer computational methods wouldn't require touching the mummies or extracting new samples at all. Egypt won't release that data either. Officials say it's stored in national archives and protected under laws that restrict access to sensitive cultural material. But genetic sequencing data isn't a physical artifact. It's digital information that could be shared instantly with researchers anywhere in the world without removing anything from Egypt. The refusal to share it suggests Egypt isn't protecting the mummies. It's protecting the narrative those mummies might contradict. What makes this especially troubling is that scientific advances since 2010 have made ancestry analysis far more precise and less invasive than it was 15 years ago. Technology that didn't exist back then can now extract detailed population genetics from degraded samples and trace lineages across continents with extraordinary accuracy. Egypt could authorize updated testing tomorrow and settle every question about royal ancestry definitively. If the pharaohs were purely Egyptian, with no significant foreign genetic input, the data would prove it beyond dispute. But Egypt won't allow the testing, and that refusal raises an obvious question. If there's nothing to hide, why block verification? The pattern is unmistakable. Requests are denied. Researchers are told to accept the 2010 conclusions without independent confirmation. Anyone who pushes too hard finds themselves quietly excluded from future excavations and denied permits for unrelated work. The message is clear. Accept Egypt's version of the story or lose access entirely. That's not how science works. That's how governments control information they're afraid to let others examine. The silence after publication. After the 2010 DNA study made international headlines, Egypt promised more research was coming. Follow-up studies were mentioned. Expanded analysis was hinted at. Additional mummies would be tested, officials said, and the work would continue. None of that happened. Instead, the royal mummy DNA research effectively stopped. No major follow-up studies were published. No expanded ancestry analysis appeared. The promised continuation of the work quietly disappeared from official statements. By 2012, 2 years after the original study, researchers outside Egypt began asking when the next phase would begin. The answers were vague. Funding issues, they were told, technical delays, shifting priorities within Egypt's Ministry of Antiquities. But funding wasn't the real problem. International institutions and universities had already expressed interest in supporting additional research. The technology was advancing rapidly, making the work easier and cheaper than it had been during the original study. What stopped wasn't science. It was the permission. Some of the international researchers involved in the 2010 project began distancing themselves from public discussions about royal ancestry. Interviews became harder to arrange. Conference presentations focused on safer topics like mummification techniques and burial practices. A few scientists who had been vocal about the need for broader population analysis went notably quiet. When asked directly about follow-up research, their responses became cautious and non-committal. That kind of silence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when people realize that speaking openly comes with professional consequences. Egypt controls access to one of the most important archaeological landscapes in the world. Researchers who want to work there, who need permits for excavations or studies, understand that maintaining good relationships with Egyptian authorities is essential to their careers. Criticizing Egypt's approach to royal DNA research or pushing too hard for independent testing is a fast way to lose that access. So, the conversation shifted. Instead of demanding follow-up studies or questioning why ancestry analysis was never completed, researchers began framing the 2010 study as comprehensive and sufficient. The media moved on to other stories. Public interest faded, and Egypt's control over the narrative solidified without anyone making a loud public objection. A few independent scientists continued asking uncomfortable questions, but they did so quietly in academic papers with careful language that avoided direct accusations. They pointed out gaps in the published data. They noted the absence of haplogroup analysis. They suggested that comparative population genetics would strengthen the conclusions, but they didn't accuse Egypt of deliberate suppression because that accusation would end their careers. Egypt didn't need to threaten anyone directly or issue formal warnings. The system regulates itself. Researchers who want to keep working in Egypt learn quickly what topics are acceptable and what questions are too dangerous to ask out loud. That self-censorship is more effective than any official suppression could be because it doesn't look like control from the outside. It looks like consensus, but it's not consensus. It's silence. The research didn't end because the questions were answered. It ended because the questions became too uncomfortable and the people with the power to continue asking them decided it wasn't worth the cost. And so, the DNA sits in storage, untested and unanalyzed, holding answers that Egypt has decided the world doesn't need to know. A history written in stone, not blood. Egypt has spent thousands of years controlling its own story. Pharaohs rewrote history on temple walls, chiseling out the names of predecessors they wanted forgotten and carving their own achievements in stone meant to last forever. Hieroglyphs could be edited. Monuments could be repurposed. Inconvenient rulers like Akhenaten could be erased so completely that later generations didn't even know they existed. For most of human history, that kind of control worked. The pharaohs decided what the future would remember. And stone was the only record that mattered. But DNA doesn't care about propaganda. It doesn't respect political narratives or national identity. It can't be chiseled away or rewritten to suit modern sensibilities. Blood tells a different story than stone. And that's exactly why Egypt won't let anyone read it. The 2010 study gave the world just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything that might complicate Egypt's preferred version of its past. Diseases were confirmed. Family relationships were traced. Safe conclusions were published. But the deeper questions, the ones that actually matter when you're trying to understand who the pharaohs really were, remain unanswered by design. Where did the royal bloodline originate? How much foreign ancestry entered through centuries of diplomatic marriages? What do the genetic markers of figures like Yuya and Akhenaton actually reveal about Egypt's connection to surrounding civilizations? Those answers exist right now in samples sitting in Egyptian storage facilities. The DNA has been extracted. The technology to analyze it exists. International researchers are ready and willing to do the work. What doesn't exist is permission. And permission is the only thing standing between silence and truth. Egypt's refusal to authorize independent testing or broader ancestry analysis isn't about respecting the dead. It's about controlling what the living are allowed to know. The longer that refusal continues, the more obvious it becomes that Egypt isn't protecting its heritage. It's protecting a story that the genetic evidence might contradict. And the story Egypt insists on is clear. The pharaohs were Egyptian purely and completely, with no significant foreign influence worth acknowledging or investigating. But history says otherwise. Diplomatic marriages happened. Foreign queens ruled. Children with mixed ancestry inherited the throne. The only question is how much of that mixing shows up in the DNA. And Egypt has spent 15 years making sure no one finds out. The evidence is there. The mummies haven't disappeared. The samples haven't degraded beyond use. The science hasn't reached a dead end. What's missing is honesty, the kind that allows uncomfortable truths to be examined instead of buried under layers of bureaucratic denial and nationalistic narrative control. Stone can lie, monuments can deceive. Official histories can be carefully edited to emphasize some facts while erasing others. But DNA doesn't forget. It doesn't adjust to fit political needs. It just sits there waiting, holding truths that Egypt has decided are too dangerous to confirm. So the question isn't what the DNA would show. The question is why Egypt is so afraid to let anyone look. If there's truly nothing to hide, if the pharaohs really were as purely Egyptian as the official story claims, then verification should be welcomed, not feared. But Egypt keeps saying no. And that answer tells you everything you need to know. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your